Warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining in. We'll just wait for a few more minutes before we begin. Thank you.
Cristiano, grazie tante pohati vamos sudah. Tahu balas so. Nama kami dan sebagainya. Nama balas so. Tapi nama balas so.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all those who have joined in today. Welcome to the third and the final day for the Global Carbon Markets Training. It's my pleasure to see so many of you who have been here with us from day one, and we look forward to your active interactions today as well. Just give you a recap for the technical assistance that we can provide to you. Next slide, please. Yes. So just to give you a recap, participants will be on mute mode for most of the session. However, you can put your questions into the Q&A box if you have any. You can also raise your hand if you would like to speak and ask the question directly. Again, we do have wonderful interpretation services available today in Bahasa, Vietnamese, and Chinese. For you to be able to access that, please click on the interpretation icon, which is at the bottom of your screen, and select your preferred language, as well as click on the mute original audio as well, so that you only hear the language that you would like to hear. We would also be using the AHA slides for the interactive session again today. And finally, we would like you to please fill in the evaluation form at the end of the session, as this will really help us not only to understand how this session was and how effective it was for you, but also in trying to plan out for future trainings that we have. So as for the agenda for today, again, we will have a few sessions on domestic offsets and Article 6, which our wonderful trainer Zot will speak to you about. However, today I would like all of you to please reflect on the 3 days that we have been here today, and also to reflect on how this training can support you and your country in meeting its climate goals. So as we move on today, we would like you to sit back and reflect on all the topics that we have discussed, and also be active in asking questions and any clarifications that you have, and always feel free to get back to us for further assistance that we can provide you. So ending with this, I would now like to hand over back to Zot to take us through the session. Thank you so much. Over to you, Zot.
Thank you very much. Good evening, afternoon, or morning to all of you all around the globe, but obviously focusing on Southeast Asia. So I guess we continue our deep dive, and today is really the deepest of the diving into the nitty-gritty of the Article 6 and the voluntary carbon market mechanisms. So let me just recall I think, one of the key findings or reflections by all of us of day 2, in which we really got to the point of differentiating the present of the emerging world of the Paris Agreement, obviously including all those elements affected by it, and comparing it to the past. Where we raised this question of, how it is different from the past. And I think I love the word cloud results on how the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, which are the cornerstone, the key building block for the Paris Agreement, have been identified. And obviously Article 6 is the building block on markets, and the actual mechanism what we have looked at, and we will continue looking at in the last day of our training. Then just a quick recap of the key messages of the second day, which really paves the way for our final day. International cooperation in climate action takes many forms and shapes, and obviously markets is one of them. And that could all be inside of the Paris Agreement through Article 6, and it could also be outside through voluntary offsets. Both of them will be discussed in more detail today. When it comes to offsets, and the creation of carbon reductions, then we really need to be looking at multiple features, such as additionality, quantification, permanence, and obviously it's not really essential to say that this is a very complex human construct in which we really need to look at very many components and explore these details, in which obviously the CDM and JI has provided us a lot of lessons which we should not forget, and obviously we should improve on all those features which have historically came to existence. Obviously the key issue, and that's why I wanted to bring up the NDCs, with the Paris Agreement, all countries have targets in terms of mitigation, and obviously it implies that countries should really decide what they do on their own and for what they bring in international cooperation partners. Finally, the rules of the Paris Agreement after 6 years of gestation came to existence at COP26 in Glasgow late last year. So we really now have the machinery, the basic rules to pursue actions using these instruments. And yes, day 2's question and answer session, which I think included some very sharp observations and remarks, also resulted in some online submissions. And I really would like to bring some of it up with the view on how they will be answered today. I think I am bringing up 3 questions submitted. One of them was asking the question of what happens if a country set unambitious targets for its NDC and then sell the Article 6 ITMOs, or at least try to do that, and how we can ensure that fairness in setting the NDC target and sell surplus results as ITMOs would not occur. This is really the big governance question on how we avoid perverse incentives being established, and how buyers could actually counteract, how they can actually push back such potentially surplus results, or hot air, as we used the term in the past, and how an international governance systems and oversight could come up to avoid such issues occurring and having perverse incentives for NDCs coming to existence, or actually not. The incentives are there, that's unquestionable, but how we can handle that and how we can build the solutions and the system which would avoid such issues taking place. And then what happens, that's the second question, on how to map and how to sort of provide that oversight on what are inside and what are outside of the NDCs, and how they relate to Article 6. And obviously the third question, which we try to answer and address today, is how Article 6 impact on the voluntary markets. In the past, that distinction was very, very clear because obviously CDM countries were without a cap. And then there were voluntary carbon markets and there were compliance markets, but they were all coming from the same countries without too much of impact on the overall governance and the overall setup of the system. Obviously, with the Paris Agreement, where everyone has a cap, a self-assigned cap, this is going to change, and this is something that we will be looking at during the day. So this would be my very quick introduction, and then let me just move to my next slide. And with that, we actually dive into today's sessions. And that's not surprisingly are really the details on how we would work under Article 6. And then obviously we will look at how we work under the voluntary carbon markets, how these are interlinked with each other, and how we can actually design our domestic systems, so-called domestic offsets, to fit into this bigger picture. So let me just start with Article 6. So in terms of content for this first presentation, we will really look at what has came to existence with COP26 on Article 6, how this is linked inherently to raising NDC ambitions, which you may remember from the Paris Agreement was the introductory line for Article 6 actions, how we stand with the negotiations. Thanks God, we have concluded after 6 years. I will reflect on some of the Article 6 pilot activities taking place, and then we would move to the voluntary carbon markets. So the learning objectives in this respect are really clear. We really want to get a full understanding of those details, the nitty-gritty of Article 6, how it links to the NDCs, and how this mechanism would play a role in raising ambitions and actually implementing the Paris Agreement. Because I guess we really need to say goodbye to the design period. We really need to focus on implementing actions and really reach the targets of the Paris Agreements, in which we will see how much of a role Article 6 activities could play a role. So looking forward, just a second, I'm just bringing up the good old picture on how we looked at the international carbon markets of the past, and this was our view on, in general, sort of conceptualizing what happens. And obviously, this is now the completely updated view after COP26. We have the international offsets programs incorporated into the UNFCCC. So this is the within Paris instruments world. Then we have the voluntary independent offsets, which are obviously also...
Sorry to interrupt you. We can't see your slides.
Hold on, then I think, again, we do have the issue which we face. So I then probably need to shut down my sharing for a second and move to the next slide in a new share session. Just a second. And thank you for interfering. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So bringing up the good old sort of thematic summary of what we have in 2022 with COP26 behind us. We have the international offset programs regulated within the Paris Agreement under Article 6.2, 4, and even 8. Then we have the voluntary and independent offset programs, again, surviving from the past. We have the regional, national, and subnational programs, which are obviously, on many occasions, are actually linked to the UNFCCC programs within the national commitments of the countries submitting their NDCs. And then obviously we have the surrounding rules around it. And within this, in terms of looking at the who buys question, which would be always very, very important to keep in mind, we have those entities who are falling under the compliance markets. And we have also the entities who would be genuinely voluntary buyers. And this obviously provides an even increasingly complex setup, again, complicated by the very fact that the NDCs sets targets for every single country. And then within those countries, there are entities who could act both as buyers and sellers. And in this respect, the Paris Agreement does not really differentiate countries in a sense of buyers and sellers, as we faced during the Kyoto Protocol, when there was a sort of single directional route for producing emission reductions, and then that being used by the buyer, the Annex 1 countries. Now everyone is equal, but obviously we will see that given the features, the cost of emission reductions, given the differences in ambition, the flow of projects will not be multidirectional. It's already very clear which directions certified project emissions would go. And this is what we will be exploring during the day. So just recall, and again, going back to the Paris Agreement, that with that addition to the NDC-driven architecture of the Paris Agreement, the parties recognized, and when we talk about parties, we talk about countries, that some parties of them could decide to use voluntary cooperation with another party when it comes to implementing and reaching the targets set in their own NDCs. And that was conceptualized as that this would allow higher ambition in mitigation and adaptation actions, again, in the context of sustainable development and ensuring environmental integrity. You know, this was one sentence really setting the tone for figuring out the details, how this will and how this would happen. 6 years later, we do have obviously the details. And the details, Article 6 have identified 3 distinct mechanisms. And in that, Article 6.2 was the one which defined country-to-country bilateral cooperations. The idea was that internationally transferred mitigation outcomes achieved in one country could actually be used by another to meet its own NDC targets. So the idea is very simple. And again, this is nothing different from the past of how Annex 1 countries under the Kyoto Protocol were able to cooperate with each other, not looking at the CDM world, the rest of the world, but really looking at actions and joint actions, cooperation and coordinated actions within their own group. Obviously, what is really important that this is purely voluntary. It really only allows to act if 2 parties or multiple parties decide to do so. It really sets the minimum standards on sustainable development, on environmental integrity, and a very robust and extremely transparent accounting in order to avoid the double counting challenges, what we have discussed. And obviously, because this is the company of adults, countries which we are taking care of their own emissions, it is really something where the Paris Agreement or the UNFCCC is not really going to regulate the details to a very big detail. What they do is they allow countries to get together. The Paris Agreement allows for or sets the boundary conditions. And obviously, as time goes, guidance will certainly be provided by the Conference of the Parties to ensure that everything which is done under 6.2 is really in line with the principles of the Paris Agreement. This is obviously foreseen as a collective learning exercise in which willing parties, and again, I should emphasize that this is it's like a marriage. You need to find a partner, you need to decide that you do something together, and then you set the rules for that, again, ensuring that you are not violating the rules of the Paris Agreement. We will see from the pilot activities that such marriages, happy marriages, have already happened, with the view that countries matching each other's needs or requirements and in full trust with each other have developed a handful of pilot projects which would actually be able to continue under 6.2 of the Paris Agreement. The other angle, and this is something which would be far more familiar to you, is Article 6.4, which was envisaged as something building pretty much on CDM, building something which would be heavily governed by a particular UNFCCC, or actually Paris Agreement body, under the oversight of the Conference of Parties. So this will be oversight and central governance by the UNFCCC in the very same way as the CDM Executive Board acted under guidance of the Convention in the full governance of CDM. Obviously, for Article 6.4, the qualitative and quantitative criteria has been set, ensuring that no double counting should and would take place through the transfer on the creation of those units. And obviously, there were some angles which, again, have been highly debated and have been a painful past on how the share of proceeds, a levy or a tax actually on the transactions, a fee set by the UNFCCC for such projects should really be used for actually adaptation purposes. Again, this has been a historical issue of how to use mitigation-related generated income for adaptation and resilience, which otherwise has very limited inflows of financing. And again, COP26 has resulted in the decisions to create that share of proceeds, 5% set on any project-related credits generated under 6.4. Obviously, 6.4 had this idea on the overall mitigation in global emissions, ensuring that whatever happens would lead genuinely to emission reductions, and that's really a reference to the past, where, for example, under CDM, a large number of credits could not really be traced, resulting in global emission reductions. Again, sounds very convincing to have those principles included. Again, the question is how this is operationalized and how we will ensure this in practice. But yeah, Article 6.4, even with a name or a genuinely used, but obviously not official name of as a sustainable development mechanism, is something which would guide us in the future to actually deliver overall mitigation in global emissions through project-based mechanisms. And obviously, this is an issue where Article 6 is inherently connected to NDCs, and we will come back to that on how a host country, a potential host country, should look at its own NDC and its participation in Article 6.4 and Article 6.2, where some of the domestic action would actually be resulting in someone else taking the credit, literally taking the credit for those emission reductions. And then let me just very briefly introduce the third leg, so to say, of the non-market approaches, 6.8, which by definition is called non-market approaches. So you would argue that this is outside of the carbon markets. And this is something which could provide a lot of innovative non-market approaches in which transactions with emission reductions would not take place. That's really the definition of 6.8. It's possible that some ODA, official development aid activities would end up here, some impact assessment, some impact investments would take place, it would obviously go into all sorts of correlated areas such as technology transfer, capacity building, and so on. The important bit here is that no units, no credits will be transferred in under this mechanism. So this is not going to change the position of the country with respect to achieving its NDC target in a quantitative manner. But obviously, if you talk about technology transfer, capacity building, sustainable impact investment, and so on, then this could actually make a major difference in terms of achieving the goals of the Paris market. And it's useful to remember that this ended up under Article 6 as well. So Article 6 is not only market mechanisms, it mechanisms all sorts of mechanisms falling under the Paris Agreement when it comes to international voluntary cooperation. So then a very quick comparison of Article 6.2 and 6.4 from the conceptual perspective, but also from the perspective of who would get engaged with these activities. And I think the key message here is that if you are a national legislator, and I understand that a large number of such national government participants we have today, then of course you need to deal with both, because you need to come up with a regulatory environment which would wisely allow both for Article 6.2 and 6.4. But Article 6.2 will be between you as a government and the foreign government. That will be the level of transactions, that would be the level of negotiations. And in that respect, you have absolutely full control, and you will be facing another governmental representative who may eventually, as soon as you agree under an Article 6.2 transaction or cooperation, would introduce you private players who might be then doing the coke stoves, the small hydro plants, the whatever projects what you are agreeing on. But the key level of negotiations, discussions, and contractual fields lies between countries, between parties of the Paris Agreement. Article 4 is different. This really goes down to the project developer level. Again, you could argue that a country itself could be a project developer, because you may seek financial contributions to a national program on energy efficiency in housing, on clean cooking, on using solar water heaters, whatever you name it. But obviously, in principle, this is a bottom-up approach in which private players or municipal players could come forward with their own projects, seeking the approval of the UNFCCC, the body set up to govern Article 6.4 projects, but obviously at the same time obtaining an approval, a very explicit approval of the host country that it authorizes such projects to take place. In order to participate Article 6.4 projects, you always need an authorization from the host country. Not surprisingly, this is very similar what we have seen under the CDM with the letter of approvals required for every single project. So all in all, you would see that in terms of governance, in terms of the parties engaged, there are differences between these two, but from a regulatory domestic perspective, it implies that you as a host country need to come up detailed rules and regulations for both. And that's the bottom line, that Article 6 really requires party engagement to a level which is unprecedented. But that obviously is linked to the fact that due to the parties having NDCs, it's extremely clear that anyone who is involved, any party, any country who is involved in these transactions is literally selling the family silver, so to say. You as a country would have this fundamental decision to be made. What are the things what you are doing on your own? And you say that indeed, I have reduced my emissions at my own effort, and this is part of my NDC. Here is the way how I have reduced my emissions. And you engage in international cooperation when someone who comes with technology, with know-how, with money, would say that at least some of those emission reductions which are generated through these activities is not going to belong to you as the host country, but you are authorizing me to take it away and claim that emission reductions back at home in my own country and contributing to their NDC. Again, on a global scale, you would not see the difference. Global emissions would hopefully be going down with a speed on a scale. But then when you look at who has contributed, you would see that through Article 6 contributions, countries would rightly and legally make claims of emission reductions which have physically happened in your country. And that's obviously a completely different negotiation position with respect to Article 6 than at the time of the CDM, where certainly any host country should be concerned of what sort of projects were authorized from their own policy perspectives, from their own development pathways, but authorizing CDM projects had not resulted in the particular country achieving or not achieving its NDC, because obviously at that time, CDM host parties had no limitations of their emissions. So with this, I think we do have the fundamental differences again highlighted between the past and the present, and between Article 6.2 aimed at country bilateral or multilateral cooperations and Article 6.4 aimed at project level interventions. So can I just ask you to dive into our first two questions of today, asking my colleagues to open up the AHA slides. And in the first question, we are asking about similarities between the past of CDM and Article 6.4 and the differences. And we really would like to create some word clouds capturing your understanding. So there will be two questions, one after the other. And then we would be looking at very quickly of these clouds. So and again, these are really the points where I should emphasize once again that there is no right or wrong answer. It's really, really something which we are interested in your views, bringing up that sort of historic comparison between CDM and Article 6.4 with respect to the similarities, which I now see on the screen popping up. And then as soon as another minute passed, we will be looking at the actual differences between the mechanism of the past, CDM, of the Kyoto Protocol, and Article 6.4, moving ahead into the future with the new project-based mechanism. I just ask my colleagues to actually include the link in the chat once more, because apparently some people couldn't type in. It's actually in the top. So the ahaslides.com text is what you need to type into your browser. Yes, and if you don't have, I mean, the link is shown, but if you go to the chat window, then you would see the link to the AHA slides as well. And then I would be just very happy to give a very quick comment as we finish on the differences slide. Because I guess this is, again, really, really nicely capturing the situation that you are a better expert on this field than I am. Definitely collectively, but that implies that certainly each and every team member have really looked at these things in detail. And just bringing up the key findings in this respect, corresponding adjustments had a very strong standing up until the last seconds. So the NDC connection, what we talked about, is really, really important. And I really understand that a painful and very difficult technical issue called corresponding adjustments, the actual change and adjustment of the NDC vis-a-vis these projects, is something what you understand. I really like the fact that sustainable development as a far broader contextual issue, which I think has been a key to the Paris Agreement, linking it to the Sustainable Development Goals came up. And in this respect, I'm just glad that these are the big letters on the screen emerging from your views on the differences with respect to the new system. So with that, let me just take back control and try to continue with my presentation, and then please tell me if whether it's visible or not. Is it visible? Do you see the PPT, or we have the same?
It just needs to be made into presentation mode. Yes.
Yeah. Now it should be in the big screen, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. So not surprisingly, the differences which you brought up is something that I have summarized in a slightly different wording, but at the end of the day, it's really the same, reflecting on the overall mitigation in global emissions, having the scopes in your own hand vis-a-vis the NDCs, and obviously this fundamental issue, and that's why also the corresponding adjustments are really, really important, that everyone can be a host and the buying country at the same time. There is no longer differentiation between the country groups. And then, obviously, by asking this question, I also wanted to introduce the fact that there is a bit of a transition taking place. So this is when we talk about the past and the present, the CDM and Article 6.4, we are not talking about a complete ending, but we are really talking about a transition process within which activities could really be transferred from the existing CDM pipeline, or even registrations into the new system in the coming years, on which the approval of the host country would absolutely be essential. Again, emphasizing that this is now a far more serious issue, and due to the interference with the NDC. The idea that all those methodologies what we have developed under the CDM should and could work under the new mechanism is also accepted, with the fact that methodologies corresponding to the projects should be authorized or could be authorized to actually moved and used in the new system. And then the big limitation, which again, I guess really shows how continuity is very important, but how the past should not undermine the future, is the actual transitioning of the CERs of the actual units generated by CDM projects. And in this respect, the limitations are very precise, and one could argue that they are relatively severe by not allowing a large number of projects, a large number of CERs transitioned or used against the first NDC compliance purposes. Again, if you consider the future, if you consider the drivers for future action using the new mechanism, this is an essential element, because if you flood the market with historic credits, doesn't matter how good or how bad they are, there will be less room for the future. There will be less demand for projects to be created at this moment. And in this respect, the agreement under the transitioning of CERs was really there to restrict the inflow of historic credits into the new system. So just a very quick recall on how parties are already eyeing on Article 6, again, in their updated NDCs, without actually knowing what would have come out from COP26 in late last year. A large number of parties indicated that they intend to use Article 6, international carbon markets, in achieving their NDCs. Obviously, there were entities who would explicitly stated that they would want to buy these units in order to meet their own NDC targets. And then this has led to academics to calculate the cost savings of achieving particular levels, such as set by the NDCs, and coming to a conclusion that these markets and this mechanism could really reduce the overall costs by a very substantial 250 billion US dollar per year. Again, the logic is something what we discussed on the first day, that 1 ton of carbon is everywhere the same all around the globe, but reducing that emission has very different costs depending on the applied technologies, depending on the location, depending on the economics of that particular emission. And hence, if you allow to move money in directions when the costs are smaller, you actually achieve a major cost saving. You can also look at it, and I hope that this will be the way of all of us looking at it, that would free up even more money to move into that directions, and actually we would go and increase our emissions, all the emission reduction levels all the time, with the view that by reaping the benefits of reducing those emissions, which are the cheapest to do, we are going down on an economic pathway which makes it easier and more attractive to reduce emissions, which would increase our appetite to increase those, to decrease and cut those emissions and increase the sinks, and then we are accelerating action. And then we would also come back to the pilot programs which were generated by the preparations of Article 6 and which have been carried out between countries, parties of the Paris Agreement. So an issue which I guess really a core consideration, and which has also led to the delay in figuring out the rules for Article 6. And this is double counting of the emissions, on which the corresponding adjustment concept came up very early, but then operationalizing it and figuring out how and where to apply it was really difficult, because obviously there were differing positions, so to say, I guess, market bargaining positions, with particularly different views of countries really geared towards environmental integrity, and some others whose major concern was maximizing the inflow for climate action. So the finally achieved agreement, and you really need to be very careful on every single word of it, is a very general and very strict application of the corresponding adjustment, basically stating that any units inside or outside of an NDC, literally anything which is done in a country would be attracting a corresponding adjustment. So what we mentioned earlier as perverse incentives, such as stating that I have a rather small NDC in terms of sectoral coverage, and I leave major sectors outside of the NDC with the view that I would attract international investment into those sectors, is no longer an option. No matter how you define your NDC, as soon as you engage in these projects, the corresponding adjustment must be made, because as soon as you transfer an emission reduction unit, you really need to reflect it on your own overall emissions, because another country would use that emission reductions claiming for its own NDC commitment. Obviously, the decision had to be made on when and how such a decision about the corresponding adjustments are made. And on that, the idea, again, very pragmatic, and again, really reflects on the past, that either when a transfer of a unit is made, leaving the country and arriving somewhere else, this corresponding adjustment must be made. Again, very logical. You can do whatever you like, but at the moment when this is transferred to another country, your own country needs to make an adjustment. Obviously, looking at it from an authorization perspective, and we talked about CDM letter of approvals earlier, and the similar requirements for approval of these transactions and the underlying projects, it is also being stated that when it comes to the authorization, it must be explicit whether it allows the use of the credit generated for international mitigation purposes. Does it allow that credit, that emission reductions, being used somewhere else? And if that authorizes such a use, then the corresponding adjustments must be made. So that's option A, and then that creates the international credit. The authorization could also lead to a point such international mitigation purposes use is not authorized. It doesn't mean that the project is not valid. It doesn't mean that it does not bring a lot of value, even emission reductions, to the host country, but that emission reductions cannot be used somewhere else. And we will come back to that on how this has affected the voluntary market. Because obviously, within the Paris Agreement, within Article 6, if there is no authorization for international transfer, there is no corresponding adjustment, then there is no transfer. Full stop. The project stays within the country, its emission stays within the country, and it's accounted under its NDC. But what happens if the authorization is not allowing for international mitigation purposes? It makes a very clear statement that the corresponding adjustment would not be made. What happens with such a project in the voluntary markets? Could that be used by someone, a corporation, or me, offsetting my airline emissions? What is the answer for that? The answer is, thanks God, is rather simple. It took some time, obviously, to establish that. Is that there will be a differentiation among within the voluntary carbon markets, whereby there will be units which should no longer be called emission reductions, should be called as contribution to financing sustainable development, for example, where it will be very clear for the buyer that it paid for something which really created value, but it does not include the authorization of claiming a credit for emission reductions outside of the country. And then you would have something which states the contribution, which states the project, but it also states that no emission reduction rights are carried with such a certification. The project activities are certified, the emission reductions are calculated, so you as a buyer would be completely aware how you have contributed in another country to reduce emissions, which stays with that country. And therefore, obviously, you would conclude rightly that you have done something very essential, very useful, but you would not be allowed to claim that emission reductions for yourself. So if it comes to your own offsetting of emissions by flying, you could be certain that someone somewhere actually did something for your money, but that emission reductions is not going to be taken or calculated by the airlines or your home country as an emission reductions. It stays with the entity and with the country where it was generated. We will come back to that later, but this is also the issue which also generates a major challenge for the voluntary carbon markets, because in the voluntary carbon markets with such rules, you would really need the corresponding adjustments. You would really need the authorization from the country to actually take away, again, I refer to the family silver, the emission reductions. And this is something which is a major challenge within the voluntary markets vis-a-vis the architecture of the Paris Agreement, which rightly allows and prescribes rules which really limits double counting and double claiming of particular activities. And then in this respect, the overall mitigation in global emissions concept is something which is one hand addressed, but there is also another angle to it where you could cancel those calculated and transferred units. You, again, as an individual, as a corporation, or even as a country, could invest in an activity, and then at the time when you receive the authorized corresponding adjustment treated emission reductions, you say that instead of using it against your own NDC and claiming it as an emission reduction, you cancel it altogether. And obviously, if it is cancelled, then certainly it contributes to the overall emission reductions. It is deducted from the host country, because obviously that's the way how it could be authorized with a corresponding adjustment. But the entity which purchases it, could be a country, decides that it's not used against its own obligations. And therefore, this would result in the overall mitigation in global emissions. Complex and complicated, we can only blame ourselves. This entire market infrastructure is purely a human construct with parties coming together and agreeing on something which would work and which would deliver the Paris Agreement. And again, if you consider the biggest criticism against CDM, that it has not contributed to overall emission reductions, because a lot of activities were not additional or was questionably additional, then you would argue and you would understand why such a long period was spent on discussing the safeguards within which obviously corresponding adjustments are the core. So given the setup, and again, now take the host country regulator hat, which I understand is a large part of our audience, what would you do? And I think these are relatively simple questions in a very complex setup. You really need to ask, what do, as a country, you want to keep, and what do you want to sell? Because you really need to recognize that as soon as you are selling something on the international markets, you need to fill that gap. It's no longer your emission reductions, it belongs to someone else. And this is something where, again, in the CDM, the low-hanging fruits have been collected. The cheapest emission reductions were done. I think the message here is that you really need to look at, as a host country, selling the high-hanging fruit, selling those costly, technologically difficult emission reductions, which you, as a country, would not be able to address, at least in the short term. We will come back to that in a rather informative chart, really showing which are the project types, what you perhaps want to do yourself, and what are the things which would be ending up dealing with within the markets. So the challenge can be again framed in the time frame of the Paris Agreement, how we try to look long term and then translate the long-term carbon neutrality commitments into medium and short-term actions. The short term is very simple. You don't want to oversell. You want to make sure that you are able to meet your own NDC. In the medium and long term, you really need to think very carefully how, by the incorporation of the offsets, you may even actually create perverse incentives for raising ambitions by yourself or by your forthcoming governments. You can really put yourself into the corner by authorizing these offsets and then really not allowing to raise your ambitions and activities on those particular fields which you might have too generously set aside for these activities. And then you also need to think on how and with what partners you can really build into your systems elements which helps raising your ambition. But this really comes back to this issue of what are those long-term commitments, what are those long-term options which are probably technologically or financially very challenging. And on that, you can certainly raise ambition by inviting parties into that. And on that, let me just offer again a lesson from the past, which again took us a lot of time to work out within the Dutch government vis-a-vis some Central and Eastern European governments, that perhaps the best way of looking at it from a technology transfer, from a fairness perspective, is you conclude an agreement with another government where you agree that you split the benefits. You really accept that this is something which needs to be done. It can only be done with foreign support, including the technology brought in for that. But then the emission reductions which are generated is shared between you, keep half of it, and then the other entity, the investor, the know-how transferer could walk away with the other half. And then it's a win-win. But again, you really need to be aware of these challenges up front. You really need to be thinking very, I guess, innovatively to find the solutions. It's certainly not a black and white situation, and there could be deals to be made. And again, if you consider that $250 billion reduction per year in terms of achieving the same target globally is real. And that is something where you need to find your own ways of benefiting from these mechanisms. But you need to be very smart, and the other side may try to outsmart you, even if that is a country and not a private player driven by a profit motive. Again, it's the system what we humans have created. We need to live with it. And again, such a training and such a discussion what we are having now will really help fairly all players to face those challenges which you will be facing as soon as someone knock on your doors, suggesting a bilateral country-to-country cooperation program, or individual investors starting to bang on your doors, asking for letter of approvals, including in the small print the corresponding adjustments. Yeah, I guess we all need to learn a lot, and we need to play with these rules. So the question, again, I have spoken a lot about the governments as regulators, as the owners of the sovereign rights of emissions and the rights of reducing them and transferring them to another country. So let us very quickly where the private sector comes into the new mechanism. Again, in connection to CDM, which was heavily driven by the private sector, we really need to emphasize that under Article 6.4, similar participation is envisaged. The projects, the interventions must and will be predominantly be implemented by the private sector. Those are the people who knows what comes out from a chimney, how to change particular technologies in order to reduce less, and so on. So public and private entities, and for public entities, again, private contractors would do a lot. It's also very important to say that the overall governance of Article 6.2 happens between governments, but the actual implementation of the projects would take place by the private sector. And that's also very, very important, because if you envisage a major scale cooperation under Article 6.2, bilateral or multilateral, the private sector would be there. And they will be the ones who would be doing projects themselves. And obviously, they should not forget that those projects are made possible by those transfers, monetary transfers between the government for the underlying emission reductions. So in Article 6.4, the private sector would hold the credits in their hands, because obviously they will be the ones who will be authorized and who would have the emission reduction certificates. And in Article 6.2, the certificates will be traded above the head of the private sector, but certainly the private sector activities will be paid from those revenues associated with that. And in Article 6.8, again, in the same way as in Article 6.2, as soon as governments are engaged in that, with the explicit statement that no ownership change will happen with respect to emission rights, the private sector will be the entities who would implement these programs. Conceptually, it is something what we need to remember, that having the ownership of a certificate would only be possible under 6.4, but the funding, which will be associated with emission reductions, would always come in particular agreements and would always eventually trickle down to the private sector players. So if you are dealing with, let's say, landfill gas capturing or biogas capturing of converting manure into biogas as a private sector player, you would be facing a situation whether, and you will find out quickly, whether such projects are supported by project mechanisms under Article 6.4 in your own country, which will be a decision by your government, or will this be something which will be supported under Article 6.2 in a government-to-government cooperation program with another country which would pay for these things? Or is it something which would fall under 6.8, where the flows of finances are, I guess, are far more indirect, while the quantification of the emission reductions would still take place, although the certificates for those emission reductions would not change hand. So again, as I said, this is a very complex and very complicated picture, but the overall underlying principles of channeling funding and technologies to reduce emission reductions are there, and they would happen through all these mechanisms, which will be pretty much decided by the regulators, by the countries themselves. So the challenging questions which we wanted to raise and which we touched based on with the overall mitigation goal and really reducing emissions is the question on how this NDC ambition increase, which is the general fundamental drive within the Paris Agreement, would take place vis-a-vis these projects. And this is yet to be seen, because in principle, this is only an option. The rules are there, both for all these mechanisms. But if Article 6.2 does not result in countries agreeing with each other in cooperation, or Article 6.4 does not result in projects being developed, again, corresponding to an existing market demand for those emission reductions, then this would not contribute to NDC ambition increase. Very simply, because the lack of activities would definitely not contribute to raise the NDC ambition or even implementing the existing NDC ambitions. Again, I think I have brought these things up on the shocking level of the ambition gap, again, referring to the 4 days old latest IPCC report. It's an urgent closing window of opportunity to act. And obviously, it's really, really drastic how we need to change our actions in terms of the scale and speed of reducing our emissions. And within that, obviously, these project interventions could play a role by following the rules. And then I would, yeah, and this is really the guidance chart, really grasping all these complexities into a very simple visual on how, from a host party perspective, I would argue to look at those activities and really decide what to authorize for international action with a corresponding adjustment. And that's really a function of the maturity of the technologies and the cost of that. Whatever is relatively cheap and is using a mature, already available, tried and tested technology is really something which should stay in the focus of the domestic actions. This is really where you can reach NDC ambition and ambition increase relatively quickly. And that already implies that whatever comes at high cost with emerging complicated technologies or technologies which have not been used in your country without having the services to support it are really the potential areas for Article 6, technology cooperation and climate finance. And if you keep that in mind, you would probably meet very quickly donor countries who have the same mental picture, who would be then willing to step in. If you ask me about the private sector, with the high cost emerging technology transfers, it's highly likely that they would also seek government support in order to do that. Therefore, it is possible, and that's my expectation, that those, I guess, non-controversial corresponding adjustment attracting activities which could and would be done under Article 6 may happen under Article 6.2, governments funding and intergovernmental cooperation being very strong. And Article 6.4 would be facing a huge challenge because countries would not allow the relatively cheap mature technology solutions leaving their country. And the corporate sector would be scratching its head to pay for the high cost emerging technology projects. But that's my very personal sort of forecast, slightly varied forecast on these markets and on the actual governance infrastructure, what we have come up with and agreed in at COP26 in Glasgow. So again, a bit of a reflection on additionality, and I mentioned hot air. Again, from the host country perspective and from the global perspective, this is really the crucial issue. And one who wants to sell project-related emission reductions should be aware that buyers are more and more demanding with respect to additionality, which can be summed up very easily, that anything what would have happened without the incentive for the mechanism, without the incentive for the project is not additional. So you really need to prove how additionality, being it financial, being it regulatory, is assessed and how this is influencing your own project. Yeah, you need to be fully aware of these questions to be raised, and you need to be able to answer it. But taking one step back and looking at this from the NDC perspective, this is where it gets really worrying from a global perspective. If it turns out, which is on many occasions the case, that the NDC target, which is obviously painted as fair and ambitious and so on, is above the projected as business as usual emissions, then you would really end up in a situation where the country, which sets that unambitious but still ambitiously painted NDC target, would end up with a lot of hot air, which they may then sell, with obviously undermining the overall goal and most probably profiting private pockets. This is not something which is simply an academic concern. This is what happened under the Kyoto Protocol between the Annex I countries. So we have historic examples of having hot air generated by overly ambitious allocations of mitigation obligations, which are now not even set by the UNFCCC, set through a multilateral agreement, but set individually by every single country setting an NDC. So this is a real regulatory trap, which really needs to be looked at. And it's also highly likely and also very hopeful that entities who would spot the existence of hot air, who would spot artificially inflated or mistakenly inflated NDC targets would run away. They would not go into countries where hot air is a real challenge, where hot air is something which could undermine the credibility of mitigation outcomes arriving from that country. And what is shocking in this respect, from a project developer perspective, you could have the best project in the world in terms of your capacities, in terms of the additionality, in terms of the technology. If you try to implement it in a country which has this hot air challenge, which has perverse incentives reflected in its NDC, you would be penalized. Very simply because the regulatory setup on the country's level would undermine the credibility of everything which is being done in the country. Again, very, very unfair from a private perspective, from the perspective of the project developer, but this is the reality, and this is the reality of the governance system what we have created. So really, you really need to watch out, and if you are engaged with transactions, I think soon a picture will emerge on countries with a high risk for hot air and with countries for a decent setup. Again, coming back to the point of corresponding adjustments, if you have hot air, if you have that artificially highly set emissions, knowing that you will be achieving that without any serious efforts, because you would have your projected or real emissions well below that, then you will be the country who would give away those corresponding adjustment authorizations very easily, because it would not influence your actual target achievement likelihood. And this is something what we have created for ourselves. You need to watch out, and you need to make sure that you push your own government if this hot air generation is apparently an issue. And if you are an independent project developer, you need to assess country risk, you need to assess countries where to go and how to avoid such an issue. Again, a complication what we have created for ourselves. Thanks God, we do have historic experiences on how and why these things occur, and how those entities who are concerned, and we should all be concerned about it, can avoid transactions or countries with such an issue. So I have already told you the solutions, or sorry, the risk, and this is really the point where the regulators of any buyers would and should step in and ensuring that additionality is really, really checked. And then under Article 6.2, this is completely bilateral, and under 6.4, it is really also under the supervisory body to look at these issues and look at these very sensitive issues on particular jurisdictions which may fall into this trap. So a very quick overview of the pilots and some lessons coming from them. You would see that all those entities who have been the pioneers of the Kyoto Protocol, or even the activities implemented jointly staged in the late 90s, are there. They are acting with Article 6 pilots, and they are obviously going out and engaging with countries actually all around the world to see how this could work. This is obviously goes from studies to actual projects being implemented and testing each other on provisions, legal provisions related to the emission reductions generated and their transfers. Obviously, the pilots took place before the actual final agreement came to existence, but yeah, there was considerable volume of activities, not surprisingly, by international multilateral development banks and particular countries who have been always involved in this field, being it Switzerland and recently Sweden joined in that. So key takeaways from this Article 6 session is really the fact that we have created an extremely complex and complicated carbon markets infrastructure globally, with all these interconnections between within the Paris Agreement and outside the Paris Agreement, with historic developments, proliferating systems, which again, we are now trying to control with the view of achieving the overall goal of the Paris Agreement. Cooperation, voluntary cooperation, lies behind the Article 6. And this is absolutely important to recognize and always remember. There is nothing to force anybody to participate in these mechanisms. And depending on the design, depending on the appetite, the market demand, this could grow or this could stay relatively insignificant. We have proven that they could heavily contribute to the lowering of the cost of achieving particular targets. It could therefore also contribute to accelerating action, because obviously you would argue that even more money would become available, and especially if these schemes are working convincingly, then that would generate its own momentum. But because of the complexities and because of the overall Paris architecture built on the NDCs and having every country in its own target, the participation is really, really critical, and the countries should really see how their own domestic achievement could be supported or could be put at risk by having participating in the mechanism. Again, remember, with the corresponding adjustments, activities which you support in your own home country could end up being implemented, happily implemented, but still not contributing to your NDC. Again, a very careful setup is required. And if you recall how complicated, complex, and difficult CDM was in terms of issuing letter of approvals without any implication for the host countries and their non-existent commitments for quantified emission reductions, you can imagine how difficult this could be, and you can imagine how difficult it will take and how much time it will take for countries actually coming up with their own approval systems. The accounting aspects is something which inherently relates to double counting, but obviously accounting and MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification for emissions, is never easy. With the NDCs, of course, you have this additional burden or additional commitment, so to say, of actually tracking your own emissions far better than in the past. It's no longer an issue to deal with inventory reports and having some friendly reviewers coming and saying that you made a mistake with your calculations. It will be an issue of life and death when you argue for your NDC achievements and proving your emission levels, not to mention the corresponding adjustments with which you can actually lose or you need to transfer some of your elements as compared to your inventories. The good news is that after 6 years of gestation and preparations, Article 6 came to life. So the rule book is there, the elements are there. We also have a handful of pilots really generating some knowledge, but I would argue that the CDM and JI experiences of the past are perhaps far more relevant and far more bulky and more significant than the lessons learned from the piloting programs. There are still some downsides. There are still some loopholes, and I mean, I mentioned one on purpose of how the averaging of emissions over years could actually lead to pretty much cheating on the system and cheating on the corresponding adjustments of taking a value which is a value over a period of time from different NDC periods, and then having the corresponding impact and the corresponding transfers not reflecting the actual emissions or the actual emission pathways. And I think, to me, the most fundamental lesson and consequence is that with the rules finally at hand, trying to govern an extremely complicated and complex setup, this is now to the parties of actually creating their own rules, authorizing participation, or agreeing with another country to come up with schemes. And this will definitely take time. This will be a challenging issue. And I think the more we know about the past, the better we will be at it. But this is not going to be an easy pathway. And Article 6 is really something which, one hand, offers a lot of opportunity for speeding up and scaling up action. But because of the complexities of its governance, its relations to the NDCs, and its relations to the real world, so to say, this is not going to be child play. This is going to be a really, really tough nut to crack. And looking back in 10 years' time, saying that we were fast enough, we have made use of mechanisms quickly, is something which will be very, very challenging and difficult to achieve. And with that, I would like to conclude this session and allow for questions for about, I guess, 5 minutes, and then we will go for hopefully for a 10 minutes break, just to make sure that we are not running out of time. Thank you very much, and let me hand back to the organizers, and then we can bring up the questions what you have submitted in the meantime, and I try to answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Zot. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A box that we can look at. Number one being, if we are to invest as an oil and gas company in offsetting project, for example, in Mexico, while we're still in Germany, with corresponding adjustments, do we receive the claims? Could we calculate the amounts of reduction in our balance score sheet, as our emission reduction would be hard to abate as part of our emissions?
And I think the two particular countries being Germany and Mexico.
Yes.
And we are talking about an oil company. Yeah, again, let me just take one step back. I would argue that yes, scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, what you directly control, is something which is already difficult to reduce. Scope 3 emissions, all the oil what you sell and being burned, is really the 90–95% of your emission contributions. So I'm glad that you are here and you are raising this question, and I am assuming and hoping that you really look at your entire scope 1, 2, and 3, direct and indirect emissions, and you want to come up with a strong plan of reducing scope 1 and 2, which you reduce through efficiency, through I don't know what, but it's something which is already difficult, but you take responsibility for all the oil what you are selling as well. And then you try to seek someone who would just produce emission reductions corresponding to these vast amounts. And then you go to Mexico, which has introduced an emission trading system, which has a carbon tax, which is really carefully looking at its own NDC and its own emission reduction pathways. So I think you would really run into a major difficulty to find anything in Mexico, any projects, what the government would be keen to authorize, unless you are able to look at upstream emissions for which you have a technology which Mexico doesn't have, And then you start talking to some gas and oil producers in Mexico about international cooperation under Article 6.2, where Germany, as the country with 2 billion euro each year going into a climate action, might simply say that, this is interesting. Why don't I talk to you as a German company with the corresponding technology? And why don't I talk to my governmental counterparts in Mexico to figure out some Article 6.2 actions? With Article 6.4, you really need to look at if that particular technology is what you are so good at is covered by an existing a CDM standard. Thanks God, because of the vast amount of work, there are really, really complicated technologies and methodologies included. Due to the European Union engagement with upstream emission reductions in the oil and gas industry, which is related to the Fuel Quality Directive, demanding oil companies actually reducing their emissions. There are other methodologies at hand, and my colleagues at Verico are a great expert on that, because we are authorized and accredited for such upstream emission projects all around the world to work with them and to certify emission reductions. And some of the methodologies are actually stemming from CDM. So I think you do need to explore all these routes. Article 6.2 with a Mexican-German cooperation, perhaps looking at this technology as you as the technology provider, if that is an option. And Article 6.4, really exploring literally everything, including those methodologies which exist for your technologies. But be prepared that Mexico might not be the country who would be the happiest to issue authorizations for corresponding adjustments with which you can bring high quality, very credible credits back to Germany and advertise your products and your activities as something which is fully offsetted by these activities. And let me emphasize that we would not solve the climate crisis if the oil companies are trying to work with offsets only. The key issue is that you need to transform yourself with reducing your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, with a view that you produce something where even the Scope 3 emissions will be reduced over time. And if that happens, and if you are looking at those residual marginal emissions, what you cannot really eliminate from your operations, but I'm talking about you eliminate 90% of your emissions, including Scope 3 emissions in the coming 20 years, and then you look at those smaller amounts. And again, as it will be very difficult to find credible credits authorized all around the world, you really need to reduce your demand, because if you are really seeking relatively small amounts because of the large scale of your own emission reductions taking place within your own control, then you might find some rather attractive projects where you might be among the very few who understand that technology, or even could participate in that project as a project participant rather than just as a buyer. I hope that I have given a rather realistic but still very positive answer on what you could do. But obviously, since I represent a German cooperative, a European cooperative of auditors, again heavily involved in the upstream oil and gas business, I would be very happy to continue this discussion with you after this session. Thank you. Next, please.
Thanks, Zot. I think a question relating to this, and I think you can answer this in short, is should the corresponding adjustments be made by adjusting the emission levels or the NDC targets?
I think I had a chart which I flipped over because I really didn't want to go into the technicalities how the adjustment can be made. But in fact, these are the solutions. And as you bring up the next question, let me just bring that screen up to my screen. So yeah, please go ahead with the third question, and then I just try to show it on the screen, that slide which addresses this particular issue.
Yeah, the third question is that among the cooperative approaches, mitigation and SDG, what if more mitigation projects, say afforestation or iForest projects, under NDCs are registered, will that destabilize carbon price and overall project scope?
Yes, hold on 1 second. I just try to. Just 1 second. I just try to bring that thing up to my screen, which is the answer for the previous question. So the emission-based accounting and target-based accounting on how you actually adjust these things. So with respect to the third question, I guess let me just give you a very general answer. And this all comes down to the very limited demand what we have at the moment. With CORSIA, we will talk about the real shock of how COVID actually shrunk the aviation market. And CORSIA was probably the largest potential demand for Article 6 projects. If we are looking at anything, and in this respect, RED+, afforestation, and all those nature-based solutions for which there are huge methodological challenges, but obviously there is huge potential. If they are all coming to the market as genuine high-quality solutions, and they enter a market where the demand is by definition very limited, or not by definition, by disaster, such as COVID, or in a market where, due to the past painful lessons, for example, associated with CDM, regulators will simply be not opening up their own cap and trade or taxation systems for compliance purposes for these units, then the price clash is almost guaranteed. And this is again something where we need to be very, very realistic, that if we don't have the demand due to different reasons for Article 6, then we would really be facing major difficulties to get these things off the ground. You know, we can have the best standards being voluntary or under the UNFCCC. We can have the best board inheriting all the knowledge from the CDM executive board. You know, we can have the best technologies. We can get every single component for these markets. But if we don't have demand, then prices will be low or zero. And then this Article 6 would just be an empty promise. It will be a machinery which would not deliver emission reductions because there will be no buyers. In the same way, with respect to emission trading systems, you can set up a system, and if you set your target wrong, applying that no one needs to change anything in order to stay within that target, you can have an extremely sophisticated system with monitoring, verification, permissions, you know, everything, which would then not work in a sense of delivering emission reductions, because we would have a close to zero price due to the fact that the demand and supply would not match. And this is, to me, one of those major issues which we need to face when we prepare for these systems. And when you, as a country, decide on how, for example, you focus time and energy on developing these systems in order to be the most attractive host for, you know, for our friend from Germany coming and trying to buy something for matching their emissions. And if it turns out that no one will be coming, or the demand will be very small, then you may need to think of domestic offsets. You may need to think of, you know, how you would achieve your own NDC with your own efforts, because possibly there's completely optional and legislative-wise voluntary elements of the Paris Agreement may not materialize. Thank you. Considering time, do we have a pressing question, Pratibha, or should we now have 10 minutes of a break?
I think we can have 10 minutes of a break.
Okay, so then we come back at 3:15, India local time.
Yes.
Yes, then have a good rest. I guess everyone would do some little work in that period, as we always do when we attend these trainings and seminars online. But see you back in 10 minutes. Thank you. I guess in the interest of time, let's dive into the second half of the day. And can you just quickly confirm that you see my CORSIA and voluntary carbon market screen?
Yes, we do.
Yes, then I fire ahead. And given the fact that, I guess these details are always very time consuming, and I guess you would also have even more questions, I would probably skip a few slides, so don't get surprised when you see that clicking it in front of your face, because obviously by distributing the slides by the organizers implies that you would not miss anything. And some of it, what I will skip, is all just sort of background or supporting materials, which you would clearly understand by following the training. So again, I will dive into the voluntary carbon markets and using CORSIA as an example. Obviously, this is the element which is now very badly affected by COVID, and I will show you the actual quantification impacts of COVID on CORSIA and how CORSIA's first years would probably without actually any effective demand due to the fact of the collapse of the aviation market. And this is obviously the rest of the day when we try to sort of link the regulated, the Paris world, so to say, through the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, with domestic activities linked to international mechanisms, such as the voluntary carbon markets, CORSIA being our example, but obviously we will also mention the gold standards, VERRA, and some other schemes. And the view and the purpose is that you would have a better understanding of these entities, their standards, their certification systems, so you would be able to decide how to deal with them. If you are a project developer, if you are a municipality, or even if you are a government. And this is again our good old Tuesday structure when we looked at different features such as compliance or voluntary participation. Again, not forgetting that the voluntary participation is the cornerstone of the Paris Agreement, Article 6, but that talks about voluntary participation of parties countries, whilst here we talk about anyone in terms of being obligated to do something on emission reductions or acting voluntarily. And then obviously we have the domestic and the international split, and the domestic international split is very important also from the perspective of having domestic offset schemes which are linked to particular compliance schemes within a country, which can then grow into international participation. That will be the last session, for which I think I can already mention a key message in advance, that you can design your own domestic offset systems with the view of opening up internationally. And then you can consider this as a learning journey of really doing something back at home, which you know best, where no one is really interfering with what you do. And then you open up that system for international participation, designing it at the first place in a way that it would meet international standards, international requirements. Again, we do have the overall summary picture in which we would now focus on the who buys question, and that's where CORSIA is in red. But obviously, we can name any other buyers using any other standards. And this is something which, again, as I emphasized in my interventions and in my answer, that no matter how great systems and governance we create, if the demand is missing, then we have a major issue. So CORSIA, let me just ask the question. What do you know about CORSIA? There's this sort of general question, but that cannot be really answered in our slide sessions. So why regulating emissions from aviation is so important. And then could you just please put down a 2 or 3 words answer, which would then emerges in our usual word cloud, showing the most important or the mostly selected or written down answers. So can I just ask our colleagues of opening up the result screen as and when they see flying in the results. Yeah, and I think I understand that some people are still typing, but the overall picture is unlikely to change. And again, I'm just so glad to see that, yes, aviation experts are sitting, or emission experts are sitting on the other side, really capturing the fact that aviation is a constantly growing share of emissions. Obviously, it even has emission contributions beyond CO2. Second, the way how emissions from aviations could be stabilized or reduced are really tricky, because aviation, sustainable aviation fuels are really far away. And they are there, but they are remaining very costly, and fuel efficiency improvements would have their own limitations. So this is a significant sector which requires regulation, where the options to regulate and to reduce emissions are limited. And there is the third angle, which is just associated with the international governance setup, that as with international maritime emissions, aviation is outside of the UNFCCC, outside of the Paris Agreement when it comes to the international context. Of course, domestic aviation, which obviously with a handful of large countries is also significant in terms of emissions, is something that countries can and would and should regulate. But when it comes to international emissions, something internationally needs to be done, and ICAO is the body who is in charge, who is mandated by the UN to act. So let me just take back the screen, knowing that I don't need to talk about too much about why and how CORSIA is attracting, or CORSIA is required, and how and why we deal with the system. And obviously this is a very good example for a system which would generate various type of credits on the ground, so we can really see. There is a bit of a historic overview, and this is now the figure which really shows how carbon emissions would be skyrocketing, would continue to grow in aviation with the increasing growth of the sector and the increasing participation of both for cargo and for personal transport, within which the challenge is how to reduce that. And within that, aircraft technological changes, operational improvements do have their own limitations, and what is shown by green, sustainable aviations and CORSIA itself would deliver or should contribute to actually putting emissions on a steady level. Obviously, everyone really needs to ask the question that would that not allowing aviation related emissions grow is sufficient, and the answer is no. But you see that even stabilizing and even eliminating the growth, anything which would be additional to the present level, 1.3% of emissions, is already a steep challenge. But that's certainly not sufficient to solve aviation-related challenges, because obviously we need to get rid of those hundreds of millions of emissions, tons of emissions, what aviation generates. And then it's a bit of a historic overview. Again, the beauty of CORSIA is that literally everyone participates who has an airline, and that's I mean there are major countries which are indicated with red, some big countries who are not part of these early stages, but who would and who should join as the system comes into full scale operations and moves from piloting to full implementation. Again, very simple. The idea is that let's capture all the planes which are in the air among those countries which are part of it, and obviously flights within countries are not included, but that's something which falls under the home country obligations. The European Union is a good example, which has incorporated the European airlines already into its emission trading system. And obviously, it also accepts the fact that sustainable fuels are seen as the major way of going ahead, and on top of that, the CORSIA scheme, the generated credits should be seen as the way to normalize, to cut all the emissions which are seen as an increase to the set baseline of 2019. And there comes the challenge, what we see due to COVID. I guess our skies have cleared up, we stopped moving, and we are glued to our screens, as we do it right now, and that is really clearly shown with the way of how commercial flights actually dumped, and we follow the yellow line, how COVID hit and how they are stabilized at a far lower level than in the past. And that's obviously something where at the time of the design of CORSIA, this wasn't really envisaged. I mean, the aviation sector never foresee that it would actually shrink. Again, many emission trading systems were designed with the view that, well, we always grow. And if something happens, then that fundamentally affects the actual design. Then obviously the industry was very quick on considering that the original plans of considering 19 and 20 emissions as the baseline should be sort of revised, ensuring that that big drop in emissions in 2020 as COVID hit is something what is considered for setting up the system. And this is now the result. And obviously, as you recall, that the amount of emissions above the 2019 levels, so the only net increase is supposed to cut and addressed by CORSIA, you would see with the red line, which is a low recovery expectation in terms of aviation, it shows no increase even by 2035 on 2019 levels, indicating that, well, let's forget CORSIA demand altogether. With a mid and with a high recovery expectation, obviously the expectations are there, but that's considerably lower than envisaged at the first place. So the calculated impacts are 25–75% decrease in offset demand in this period, and obviously we are talking about a long period of time. So what sort of credits you would allow into CORSIA? Not surprisingly, this was built on the previous experiences of project-based credits, and therefore all those elements, again by another UN mandated body, the International Civil Aviation Authority, was listed what we have seen for CDM, for what we have seen for Article 6.4. Basically, there is no differentiation. There is no additional criteria, but the good news is that the generally applied quality criteria applies to CORSIA as well. Then, not surprisingly, then they had to take the next step on saying, well, we apply these criteria, but whom you are going to work with? What are the standards and what are the certification entities whom they will accept? At the moment, there are 8 of those who would be allowed to certify emission reductions, and I can mention in brackets that Verico got accredited for the Global Carbon Council. So I'm actually representing an auditing cooperative who is now authorized to certify credits under CORSIA. But again, no one is going to knock on our door because there is no demand. So there will be no projects being certified which are driven by demand from CORSIA for the coming years, as I have demonstrated in the previous slides. Again, technical details, how this is phased in, the typical way of how you have a pilot period, how you really deal with learning first the monitoring of the emissions, and how you step by step introduce these elements. And then, yeah, the shocking views on the demand. And this is something which is not my own judgment. It's the latest late last year's summary written forward by the European Commission, concluding that the aviation industry is not expected to recover before 2023 to the levels of 2019. There will be no or few offsetting obligations for CORSIA's pilot phase running until the end of next year. Again, this is fully in line with what I have indicated with the airline forecast of volumes and emissions. And you know, when you see zero demand on a system which is already there, and I have listed all those major credit standards, then that's a very painful feeling. There is still supply because there are projects who are really trying to find buyers, and that goes into hundreds of millions of tons. And you can imagine when you have this discrepancy between demand and supply, then you have a price crash, unless you have other entities stepping in as a credible and able to pay demand. So again, the very basics on how you set the rules, and that has been summarized, how someone, an auditor like myself, looks at the eligibility determination, how these issues could be and should be met. You do have those system setters who are really deciding who is allowed to come in and what these requirements are. And then the actual projects take place by realizing that there are the rules, there are the precise eligibility and operational modalities defined, and then project start operating and issue credits. And that's something which applies, and that connects me from CORSIA, the example, to voluntary carbon market as the whole. And on that, I really would like to raise another question on standards and certification programs, what you know. Again, focusing on the things which are outside of the Paris market. So what has been called as the voluntary carbon markets is something where I understand that many of you have even been operated in or followed very closely. So let us bring up question 24 on our slides and see what are the standards and certification programs, what you are most familiar with. And let's hope that this slide is not going to bring in too many of the surprises, but I'm also hopeful that we will all see small letter additions, which we have not seen yet, again, clearly showing that we are facing an extremely dynamic and fast evolving market. But then, yeah, as soon as And again, sometimes we do have the beauty of these clouds. If someone makes a mistake, that pink one, which I guess was just a typo, then we have some really intriguing and mind-boggling elements. But I guess with the rest, and again, we do have the typing things when Verra, which comes with 2R, is written with 1, but certainly we are fully aware who they are. And yes, there are indeed some less known entities or systems like IREC, dealing with the power industry and decarbonization within the power sector and trying to link power producers and their renewable projects to the carbon market. Yes, I guess I should really report this back to my friends at the Gold Standard, that they were the ones who got the biggest figures, so the most hits. But I guess Verra and VCS should be combined, and I guess they should also be feeling convinced that the two largest got the highest scores. But obviously, I would add WWF to the Gold Standard as well. And then we see Red Plus coming up, and yeah, CDM from the past, the Japan crediting mechanism, and the American Carbon Registry, again dating back to the very, very early days. Thank you very much. Again, the very clear message that this is an audience with skills, with exposure, with presence in this market, really bringing up that tiles and picture of what is happening in the world. Just trying to take back control. Again, please confirm if you see my screen, because this is the bit. So is it okay? You see question 24?
Yes.
Yes. What a surprise. I guess, yeah, the climate action reserve from the US is the only one which came up in our discussions, but the rest with the VCS Verra and the bottom left corner all coming up, and obviously the UNFCC is there, because yes, we should certainly not forget CDM and now the new mechanism under Paris. So a quick overview on how big these markets are. Again, growing fast, and going into a few hundred million value of transactions, and the volumes are year on year growing, delivering a few hundred million tons. Again, if you consider the challenge, going obviously into the billions, this is marginal. You may recall how Mark Carney, a former Bank of England head, went into his effort to multiply by 10, or factor of 10 or 15, the size of the voluntary carbon market through a task force, which really brings in everyone from this field. It's clearly the place which is going to grow. But as I mentioned, with the complexities of the international setup and with the inherent interconnections with NDCs and the way how the Paris Agreement puts NDCs into the central role, voluntary carbon markets do have a challenge. So the compliance market interlinkages is something which, again, we should not only be looking at from the perspective of the NDCs and the Paris Agreement, but we should really look at particular schemes which could actually attract demand, which could actually create the demand for offsetting. And these could all be both compliance and voluntary initiatives, and it could be both domestic and international. So in this respect, we could be concluding that the voluntary markets are actually serving the same markets as what we see under the Paris Agreement and Article 6, both in terms of geography and in terms of compliance nature. Obviously, the voluntary markets are serving voluntary purposes as well, which are in this respect the only angle which is outside of our Paris scope, where obviously we try to see the whole world under a major obligation or self-set compliance to achieve the Paris Agreement targets. Just bringing up a few examples, which I think you are more familiar than you are familiar with. Again, thousands of projects are being certified, and again claiming over their long life, decades-long lifetime, almost 1 billion ton. Same price applies to the gold standard, but I really would like to highlight how gold standard, reflecting on these changes and reflecting on the sustainability agenda arising, introduce the gold standard for the global goals, where they are really able to step out from the sort of narrow focused, let's generate high quality carbon credits, into generating actually impact in along all sorts of SDGs, with a holistic contribution to climate and development, obviously with the ability to quantify the climate impact as well. And that's also, to some way, you would see it as an escape route, because by doing high quality climate projects with major SDG impacts, you could really see monetization not through the climate features, which would be by definition restricted by the corresponding adjustments and the NDC complexities, but monetizing through other impacts. And that's something where I think the gold standard was really the first to recognize the challenge with the disappearance of the Kyoto world and with the emergence of the NDC-driven world of the Paris Agreement. And by 2017, they were ready with this gold standard for the global goals approach. Again, we don't need to repeat how the double counting and double claiming issue is always lurking around. It's always extremely painful, and this is really something where undermining the integrity of the Paris Agreement and the voluntary markets is key, for which obviously solutions are really not too easy. But my conclusion is rather simple and might be overly simplified, that if claims are moving towards financing or supporting NDC development, again, for example, through the gold standards, global goals approach, then anyone who is paying is getting actually even more than the value of the emission reductions, because then you would contribute to other features as well, where obviously you would have an understanding of how you have contributed, how much changes you made. And then the only change as compared to the past is that your claim will not be on that single feature and existing feature of emission reductions, but it would be towards the financing and the support to the NDC of the particular country where this project has taken place. Again, I'm hopeful that this is not too complicated to be accepted and understood by those who would be interested in making those projects which are really contributing to sustainable development on a global scale, with particular emission changes and emission reduction changing features, and entities would be keen on engaging, knowing that the credit would fall on the country, whilst obviously that country would be rightly proud and transparent and loud about the particular project intervention which helps it achieve its NDC. Obviously, when it comes, and this is something which I mentioned, and I just want to make sure that this is brought up in a written format, how the lack of corresponding adjustments, which is again a particular solution dealing with emission reduction project authorization, it would end up by having voluntary carbon market credits, which should not really be called VCM credits any longer, in my view, with the label that it's carrying a corresponding adjustment. So we would have the VCM credits, again, as expected, surviving from the past, which carry the corresponding adjustment. They will be genuinely carrying the emission reductions anywhere where they go, or whoever wants to use them, even for compliance purposes in another jurisdiction, because the corresponding adjustment is made. They will be real carbon credits to be utilized globally. And then all these standards with their valuable contributions methodologically to quantifying emission reductions, and in case of the gold standard, quantifying other sustainable development contributions will be explicitly stating that they are without the corresponding adjustment. So they will not be able to claim and to be used as an emission reduction in any compliance, emission trading, or taxation system around the world. And we will see how this will evolve. And obviously, if such differentiation evolves between those units under the same standards with or without corresponding adjustment, it's highly likely that the corresponding adjustment label would attract a higher price, whilst the other ones will be traded lower. Very simply, because there will be an inherent recognition of the corresponding adjustment of the tradability of the underlying emission reduction. Then the way how carbon markets in general, and that is true for the voluntary carbon market, is really affects the speed and scale of change. It really comes down to the quality of these carbon credits. If they are highly additional, then they would definitely contribute to overall emission reductions. That's very clear. This is going back to the screen where I presented how the low-hanging and the high-hanging fruits should be separated, and these voluntary transactions would attract the same high-hanging fruits credibility issue as Article 6.4. I expect that this would and this should take place by addressing the most costly and challenging mitigation options, with voluntary markets being really proud of actually working at the boundaries, really pushing action further and faster in host countries where without the engagement of these voluntary market players, these things would have not taken place. And I'm hopeful that the voluntary market will not be full of really credit destroying and strange carbon market cowboys, which we have seen in the CDM in large numbers, because obviously there will always be people who would only be after the money. But that's, I think, up to us, decent market players, to recognize, name and shame them, and not allow the market credibility being destroyed by the crooks and by the criminals invading this field. But certainly, this is a challenge, and in every new market, those players are always abound, and then it's the market which should be taking care of itself by expelling those players, naming and shaming their activities, and pointing out that the general credibility and the general quality of the market is defined by those high quality standards and certification agents who are acting there, and others who might come in with some other goals and with other quality requirements could really be pinpointed and could be avoided by anyone who is serious on the environmental integrity and on the need of genuine additional climate action. So the key takeaways, I guess, please try to remember that the CORSIA demand collapse is a one-off. it doesn't mean that these voluntary entities would not operate. And please try not to remember my little figure with the zero as the demand. We do have a very healthy and improving architecture for the voluntary carbon market, which is obviously made very, very complicated through the introduction of the NDCs and the Article 6 mechanism. Again, remember, the voluntary carbon markets have been around for far longer than the Paris Agreement. So this is something which creates a major adjustment push. It's a reality check for the voluntary carbon market, how they could survive and how they could evolve in a situation when the Paris setup with the NDCs really allows limited and very complex rules for existence for other players through the corresponding adjustments. And again, remember that corresponding adjustments are compulsory, so to say. So from the NDC perspective, this cannot be avoided. If someone authorizes an emission reduction project to be taken outside of the country as an emission reduction, then CA must happen. But that doesn't mean that activities without a CA with other sustainable development benefits could not flourish and survive. This is an issue where I think the gold standard is the best example of how an evolutionary challenge, so to say, the emergence of the Paris Agreement forced a market player who was obviously very strong and outstanding in its quality supply of high quality projects, actually managed to sort of reinvent itself as someone who looks at SDGs and certifications and evolves or develops a certification system for going beyond emission reductions. Other market players have chosen different routes. Other market players have not really reflected in this challenge, and we will see how this will work. And with CORSIA, what we need to keep in mind that the aviation sector must reduce its emissions, and obviously emission reductions by disaster, such as the cut in flights due to the COVID pandemic, is not the solution. In the same way as it is not the solution for our overall emissions. And with that, let me just move to the next slide, which I understand I should stop sharing. And as I do that, are there any questions which came up in the meantime in the QA windows? Pratibha, could you just share insights and questions from the audience? Thank you.
Yes, there's one question. Can carbon registry standard agencies, are they mandated to disclose carbon projects and carbon emission from each company under any data disclosure policy? Do these agencies come in any data disclosure with UNFCCC or any other international agencies?
Yeah, this is again the distinction. Voluntary in this respect, again, forget the voluntary nature of countries participating in Article 6 mechanism, means that these entities, although they are falling under the jurisdictions of the countries where they operate, they have nothing to do with the UNFCCC, for example, they have nothing to do with the Paris Agreement. Therefore, disclosure arrangements cannot really be made. That's really outside of the scope of the Paris Agreement of making disclosure obligations to private players who operate in national jurisdictions or even under international jurisdictions, because they are not under the governance of the Paris Agreement. What I understand, and this is something of an interesting market dynamics, that due to the increasing volume of greenwashing, of painting whatever we do as the most sustainable in the universe, a lot of jurisdictions, and in this respect the EU is a good example, is really strongly coming up on disclosure requirements related not to the certification entities, not to the systems which are claiming to be voluntary market standards, but towards the corporations. those entities who would claim to offset their emissions through using voluntary mechanisms should really be reporting very carefully on how they set their targets, what happens in their supply chains, and that would probably include how and with what they are offsetting. So it's my expectation is that sustainability reporting, which is now becoming the mainstream by regulators in each and every jurisdictions, or even according, the international accounting standards are looking at the sustainability aspects, would soon get to the point where there will be huge scrutinization of emission reductions, in the same way as corporations will be scrutinized for their emission levels. Of course, if they meet part of their obligations or part of their pledges on carbon neutrality or net zero, which is the corporate term, someone should be first forcing them to disclose the underlying emission features, should disclose their target setting methodologies, and that includes also the way how they are going to use particular offsets. So I expect a rather indirect mechanism in which, again, parties, countries, having their own NDCs, would be getting more and more interested in their regulated and unregulated sectors, ETS and non-ETS sectors, all of their corporations and all of their banks reporting on their sustainability features, which again looks at supply chains even outside of the country. So my hope is that the general corporate governance, again, on the country level, really ensuring that, for example, finance becomes sustainable, implying that it finances only sustainable activities and it moves away from the unsustainable, through the use of taxonomies, again, very precise in defining what is green and what is not, would eventually lead to different entities being forced to disclose what they do. And again, as I said, I don't expect that the already very public, I have shared these details, the gold standard or Verra or any standards is very open in telling what they do. But how those projects and how those credits are used will be another point of disclosure, and that would become a compulsory disclosure in many jurisdictions, because the regulators really want to see how the pledges, the net zero pledges by corporations, are actually converted into real, transparent, and verifiable action. And in this way, I expect that disclosure requirements would include a lot more on climate action. And if it includes climate action, then certainly it would include all those offsets, what entities are using to claim that they have reduced emissions. I hope this is addressing the question. Thank you.
Thank you. There's another question on, in the Indian case, few airlines are doing CSR activities under ESG obligation. In such a case, are these non-BSR activities to be considered under the carbon mechanism, provided that they are registered?
Super question. And again, this really highlights how sometimes those who are acting are penalized. Let me explain. Being slightly familiar with the Indian CSR obligations. Again, to me, that's a really advanced step to ensure that corporations are doing something in the sustainability domain. And this is, if I'm not mistaken, is set as a particular percentage of revenues to be actually spent on CSR activities. And this is an obligation. So following the logic, what we are trying to establish, if this is something which is already a very strict and heavily enforced obligation in a particular country such as India, then this cannot really become a project which is additional to the existing requirements. And that's, I guess, that's the sort of strict translation of these activities. However, and this is really the point where learning is always beneficial, if the CSR obligations have already generated a marketplace to generate that sort of high quality contributions, including climate, falling under CSR. And there are companies who would say that I want to do more than my obligation, then India would offer the perfect ground where those who developed CSR projects with a climate contribution could now say, hold on, let's develop or extend those projects what are now financed through the CSR contribution into the climate domain, with the view that perhaps the very same corporate entities, the very same buyer would then be interested in that. And then, surprise, surprise, you might have a domestic trading scheme, a domestic offset, which then is increasingly going into a voluntary domestic market for those activities, which is on top on the CSR obligations. And then when Prime Minister Modi hears about it, then he says, hold on, why don't we find another country which would be interested putting even more money into those brilliant projects, which we have been doing for 5-10 years already because of our CSR obligations. So what I see as something which is taking place in the sustainability domain would be extended with, I mean, not abandoning the sustainability aspects, but calculating the climate aspects, and then allowing it to be used domestically in, again, that requires a bit of a design on how not only CSR obligations companies would have, but they would have an obligation to contribute to the 2070 carbon neutrality commitment of India. You know, you have all those challenges. I would try to recall a few on, you know, from clean water to toilets to waste, which has been developed in India over the years. You would then develop a corporate contribution to the 2070 achievement of carbon neutrality, for which you already have this domestic offset scheme. So it will be contributing to your NDC. And if someone comes in with more money, or perhaps with more technologies, then it would be still contributing to the carbon neutrality, but then the Indian government might consider that some of it, the generated emission reductions, could be split with another country. Very simply, because without this move, which you try and test, and for which the projects you develop through corporate contributions through Indian entities is extended to the world, and then there will be, you know, the pension funds who are really concerned about poverty alleviation, clean water, you know, all sorts of things which are being addressed, would then be adding more money to that, and then would accelerate India's move towards 2070 carbon neutrality. So I really see that whenever something is done driven by a different purpose, and it has a governance system, it has the legislative backing, and it really has the market players, then you really need to build on that. And I think this is just an example where increased climate ambition and the machinery what you have is really something which I would propose for India and for any other countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. That was wonderful. There's one last question, quite an interesting question. So can the carbon market platform be put in the form of a stock exchange?
To just repeat, so how carbon markets could be put on stock exchanges, or even creating stock exchanges for carbon projects?
Stock exchanges for carbon projects.
Yeah. Again, this is taking place. These are traded commodities. And again, that's where the CDM has already proven really instrumental on how, you know, billions of worth CERs started to be traded by those power sector players, for example, who are already very good at trading commodities. The same applies to the largest agricultural commodity players picking up on those. So this all comes down to standardization and to the very standard features of carbon credits. And this is obviously, to me, the big challenge, because yes, we talk about a ton of carbon, but as soon as we look at behind the standard, the methodology, the jurisdiction, and so on, we would end up realizing how different this could be. You may recall the 8 different schemes authorized under CORSIA to provide a ton. And if you look at those tons, and if you look at these various projects, you would probably quickly recognize that, well, they are not exactly the same. And then obviously you would also allow people simply say that we want particular jurisdictions, sub-Saharan Africa, or we want vulnerable communities being served, or we want particular technologies, or we don't want particular technologies, which may still falling under particular projects. So it's a really, really, really hard nut to crack, very simply because underlying a ton, again, which could be also in a sink permanently, or it could be an emission reductions compared to a baseline. The color and the shape of each and every unit, which are apparently standardized, could still remain very, very different. And this is really the issue where I would not expect that a stock exchange would evolve for the universal carbon credit. But as in stock exchanges, you trade with different corporation stocks. I would argue that these carbon markets or platforms for trading would trade with these different units. So in this respect, CORSIA would never end up with a CORSIA unit. The CORSIA unit exists in the system for compliance purposes. CORSIA would always have those different schemes and those different certifications, systems and standards providing it. And then on those markets, on those platforms, when you are allowed to buy a carbon credit, you would always be able to express your own preferences. And then the brokers will be able to tell you what are the most matching standard or certificate type of what you want to deal with. And again, the example of the differentiation between corresponding adjustment attracting high value credits and those which would be not having a corresponding adjustment are very, very good examples on how tradable certificates would have very different lives, very different buyers, and very different prices. Thank you.
Thanks, Ot. I think we should now move on to the next session.
Yes, I take that and I immediately dive into the last session slide, which I need to find, and that's, hold on just a second. Yeah. And then again, you need to confirm as and when you see this.
Yes,
the
we see
domestic
the
offsets.
first slide of domestic offsets.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Domestic offsets, I already introduced them. This is really something where you need to do a lot of thinking, and I think this answer on what India could do with its CSR obligations, which generated large number of projects and project developers, is really, really a good example. And again, as we will be distributing this, let me just skip a few. And this is really the key concern. We have really started with the globe, then we looked at the international interconnections, but we should not overlook the fact that what you see on the left-hand side, on a jurisdiction level, you would always end up with non-covered sectors. The larger emitters are likely to fall under an emission trading system or under a tax system, but there are always households, there are SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, there are agricultural households, and so on. And these could well be considered as the sources of domestic offsets. And again, instead of trying to understand the international implications, you just sit back as a regulator, you say, I have an NDC, I set a net zero target, or I didn't dare to set it because I still don't know what I am emitting or how I am going to develop. Why don't I think of domestic offsets? And this is really, really encouraging in a conceptual sense, because domestic offsets really allows to get emission reductions in all sectors. And it allows to do it and to be designed within a country. You don't need to be bothered about all the others. And the good news, what I think I explained for how an Indian non-emission reduction oriented system could grow into emission reductions, because it has all the machinery and all the ingredients of effectively working and being implemented. Domestic offsets could always be considered as the entrance to international offsets, especially if you design them in a way that they match the requirements of international offsets, which again is not rocket science, because you just look how and what international offsets are available, what are their standards, what are their certification requirements, and then you somehow generate and create your domestic offsets. Again, this is something which has been slightly overlooked in the past, but if I show you the map, which shows obviously normally larger sized countries with their domestic offsets, you could see that there is again a lot to learn from. In the middle of the map is Europe. We have spent a decade on discussing domestic offsets related to the EU emission trading system. But due to the fact that the EU emission trading system was designed with another rule and set of regulations on effort sharing between the member states, eventually these discussions on a top level, on an EU level offsetting scheme didn't materialize. But that's again a very peculiar feature of a rather federal EU ETS system, where EU member states were really left with the obligation to deal with the non-covered emissions. Again, you would see China slightly bigger than the EU, considering this, and obviously you see colorful Canada and US with their federal systems or provincial systems heavily relying on offsets. That's again a summary table on showing how this evolved over time, and how many sectors, from forestry to buildings to industry, small industry, non-covered industries, and agriculture got engaged. Again, this is really just common sense. I was probably very fast, but then let's try to capture whether you see the benefits and drawbacks of domestic offsets on the basis of the last 5 minutes and on the basis of the discussions in the 2.5 days. So could I just please bring these questions up on the screen on our slides by our colleagues? And then again, I am expecting that you would be bringing up the keywords which would be correctly representing realities on why you would have benefits of domestic offsets. Thank you. Thank you very much. Again, I think it was slower and less contribution. So I guess one needs to remember that domestic offsets perhaps are heavily overlooked, whilst obviously with the NDCs and with the Paris Agreement, this should be core and center. But that is obviously something which is already coming up, that local interventions and reduction of local emissions and having local impacts is really, really something what would drive and what would be benefiting countries in a very, very big way. Not to forget that you always know far better what is happening next door, or actually when it comes to emission reductions, what is not happening next door. And yes, I guess you may just ask the question that why on earth I go to another continent if I can do something next door. Certainly, there comes the issue on technologies, on finance, and so on. But one thing which we need to keep in mind that if others, due to those inherent limitations on the demand for these activities, are not coming to you, or because they are very busy at home claiming that they have to reduce their own emissions in their NDC rather than going somewhere else to make that reductions, then I think there will be a door opening up for domestic emissions, domestic offsets. And that's also where you really need to remember that I think any domestic scheme which is run professionally, convincingly, is really, really a best step to actually move into the international market, saying that indeed we have done something, it works, have a look, not documentation, but reality. If you want us to make this bigger, then you come in and then we create the corresponding deal. And I think this is really the message what we need to keep in mind for domestic offsets. And that's really the issue where one really needs to remember that with the NDC, with the Paris setup, we will really always be asked first from the international community, what are you doing at home? What are you doing on your own? And then obviously you add that I am doing all these things and I would benefit from an extra hand. But the more you have already done, obviously the more you have achieved from your NDC, and the more convincing you would become. And yeah, this is the written summary of this, in which I really, really want to emphasize that this could well be an instrument for international cooperation. See it as a stepping stone, see it something which you need to do anyway, because obviously with your NDC and with the global challenge, we are all supposed to do our utmost in terms of scaling and speeding up climate action. And the earlier you come up with a convincing domestic offset scheme, the better and the bigger interest it will generate for others. Obviously, there are not only benefits, there are risks, because obviously as soon as you design something in which you allow, for example, a domestic emission trading system obligated entity not to purchase the allowance from the government, but to do something next door with an entity which does high quality offsets, then surprise, surprise, the government would have less revenue, because the system design allows compliance through domestic offsets as opposed to purchasing a permit from the government. It's also true that, and this is again a big design question, if you create a system, an emission trading system, which allows a lot of domestic offsets in, then the actual mitigation level within that system, within those plants, within those emitting entities would be reduced, because someone else back at home, perhaps even next door, would make those interventions. Obviously, it's always difficult to predict offset supply, and that's a challenge for the designer. And then obviously we need to not forget that if the offsets are designed poorly and the environmental integrity or additionality is not there, then we shoot ourselves in the leg, we create a system of a sophisticated, complex system with respect to emission trading, taxation, and domestic offsets. And all of a sudden, we recognize that our emissions are not increasing, but at least you would know why. You can investigate how to change it and how to improve it, because it will be all in your jurisdiction, with your oversight, with your regulatory powers, and with your good understanding of your own inventory. So I guess these are really the elements what could be seen as a mirror from the international regulations and rules. So I will be just skipping them very, very quickly because these are pretty much common sense, and the same applies to them what applies to international credits, and what we discussed on the first day and the second day with respect to overlaps, with respect to complementarities, or even countervailing measures. Because with domestic offsets, you are just introducing another domestic policy measure for climate action. And again, you always need to think long term in order to see how this would fit into your NDC, and how you can actually expand carbon pricing to the entirety of your own economy. And that's something which is a message from day one. Pricing carbon does help. It really, really changes behavior. It changes technologies. It will accelerate action. Think about it and realize that whatever you emit domestically could all be covered by domestic offsets and emission trading schemes and carbon taxation. Again, a few safeguards, which again, I would be just skipping in the interest of time, and then showing that there are a large number of these systems already in existence and operation, with a lot of different qualitative and quantitative limitations, ensuring that they are not undermining those systems what they are linked to. Because, you know, with domestic offsets, you should not forget that they are always needs to be linked to something of a compliance a measure, being an emission trading system or being a tax system. And you see, this is really, really reflects lessons all around the world. Some lessons are really, really striking. Some lessons are really, really insightful, including the EU's own learning curve climbing on how international credits were first allowed, then how they were restricted to least developed countries, how particular technologies were excluded, and how by now, based on this learning curve, phase 4, obviously trying to decarbonize the economy itself rather than allowing it to purchase offsets, would not be using domestic offsets at all. But that's a journey. You start with domestic offsets in order to get rid of them. In the same way, you expect that carbon taxation revenues in 2050 will be zero, because there will be no emissions. And the emission trading system would have a limit of zero, because all those entities would no longer be emitting CO2 or any other greenhouse gases. So there are, there are a few issues on how the short and the long term could be slightly different, and how you always keep the long term in mind. In the same way, with your NDCs, you really need to set your long-term perspective first, and then you translate it into short and medium-term actions. Very same situation as with our overall framework, but obviously with domestic offsets, you do have the name, you do have the answer. It always remains within the nation. It always domestic buyers who again should constitute the demand. Then you then have a successful system. And then again, noticing how late I am on time, I'm just skipping a few elements, and then as a summary, bringing up how you have different designs in terms of allowing or not allowing use of offsets. And again, that's also something where over time the situation could have changed. There are designs which simply says we are not interested in offsets. there are emission trading systems designed, including the ETS at its first allowing and then later on phasing out. New Zealand is also the example where the phase out has occurred. And then there are a large number of systems which were designed trying to link domestic action in a complex and complicated manner, allowing domestic offsets in. The trends, we would really need to see an increase. That's my expectation, because of the NDC setup really puts the onus on the national level to act in every single field. And if you are acting in every single sector, then domestic offsets would and could occur. Again, I think it's also a life cycle question. At the beginning of systems, these are really good ways of safeguarding acceleration, safeguarding even cost containment, or reducing cost. We will see, and then we should not forget the fact that the harder to abate sectors, where we are always looking at under the NDC's international solutions, could also be tracked and attacked and solved by these domestic offset schemes, mobilizing larger industrial players, actually solving problems, emission challenges, what otherwise would be left for later. I have a handful of case studies which provide the details on how and why offsets were included, what impacts they had, and how they then led to changing regulations and actually the elimination of offsets, with some particular details on how volume of offsets could actually proven to be the lethal driver for price changes. Again, New Zealand running into the same learning issue of having offsets and then recognizing that this is not going to work, then introducing domestic offsets. In South Korea, again, having particular limitations and encouragement of domestic and even international offsets by Korean companies themselves to be adding to their systems. Having an extremely complex and sophisticated system in California, designed from the start. I mentioned China, on how China actually using its own Chinese CDM credits and authorizes them, and there are a few examples where it happens through taxation. Singapore just announced that from 2024 offsets will be authorized and allowed from 2024. I understand that they consider domestic offsets, but if you look at the map and realize how small Singapore is and how advanced it is, it's very clear that they might just use offsets from abroad. Then some rather inspiring examples from Colombia, really linking the carbon tax with afforestation and reforestation activities. And then let me just conclude by recalling how we really need to do always a holistic and complex approach, seeing emission reductions all across our economies, really seeing what can come from abroad, what should come from within the country, how for that we do have different tools and different methods, different compliance schemes, really pushing up the scale and speed with we act. And with that, I would like to conclude and would ask Pratibha and the organizers whether we would have another 10 minutes, perhaps, a bit of an extension to have some compulsory parts, which would be the evaluation of the training. But I would also have some closing slides, if you don't mind. Plus, obviously, we might have some questions on domestic offsets. But then I guess let's ask the organizers whether how long, how much longer we can stay. And then obviously, if you need to leave as a participant, then that certainly you can do that. It was really just my fault of being carried away with all these details of my own presentations and then diving into the questions, which yes, occupied and used up our full time planned for this day. Pratibha, just please advise.
Not at all. I think we can extend it if the participants are okay with it for another 10 minutes, so that we can have a good concluding session for the 3-day training. So carry on, Zolt, and just to let all the participants know, yes, the recordings will be shared with you along with the training material. So please don't worry about receiving the material after the session. We will send you all the training material as well as the recording subsequently. You can carry on, John.
I will do that. I'm just having some trouble finding my closing slide. Hold on a second. Here it is. And then again, you just need to tell me whether you see my screen. Is it visible? The final wrap up.
Yes.
And again, I just want to make sure that, yes, we do not forget the big picture on how we learned about carbon pricing in its context, how it is a powerful tool to address a market failure in the markets. So we do have hopefully a better set of arguments and understanding of how we fight market failures by changing and improving our markets, how it is always a choice, a domestic choice on what we do and how we do it, and how we link it to the international markets. I am hopeful that the last 3 days really helped to understand these elements of the jigsaw puzzle and the way how they are inherently interconnected with each other, and how and why you really need to push hard to get a larger market solution in the climate field, and how, when we meet next time, we would be able to report on how new regulations, new implementation modalities are mushrooming all around the world with the view of pricing carbon and putting a price on emissions becoming part of the solution what we face in our climate challenge. And then I really would like to ask you to answer 2 questions based on the last 2 days. On the first question being, what is your key takeaway from this course? And then the second is actually a far more personal question on how and whether you have come up with some ideas which you can turn into a commitment to act within the domain of carbon pricing in your own country. So again, 2 questions will be brought up on the screen. One reflects on what is the most important takeaway, the most important lesson, what you have learned, and make sure that you give a very concise answer to that. So it comes in an aggregated way on the screen in a word cloud, and what could be your commitment to act to advance carbon pricing back at home as you leave the training. And then we will have, I think, 90 seconds for both questions. And I really would like to ask the organizers to, I guess, to allow the 2 questions to be answered first, and then we will return to the results together. So we will look at the results slides in one go after you have the answers collected for both slides. Thank you.
Zot, I think you're on mute. I'll just now start sharing my.
I am sorry. I unmuted myself first. Now I am just saying that, yes, we would really like to see the takeaways and then reflect very briefly on the personal commitment. And I see that you are still typing. And without really influencing the discussion, let me just reflect on adaptation and resilience, which, I mean, obviously we looked at the subjects and carbon pricing with a mindset on focusing on mitigation. That was our overall framing. But I think we really need not to forget, and again, recalling one of the first votes in which you stated unequivocally that adaptation and mitigation are equally important. So in the context of carbon pricing, we should not forget that message, and we should always remember. Second, when it comes to resilience and adaptation, whatever we do in mitigation either would have a co-benefit or an impact or perhaps even a trade-off with respect to adaptation, and that is something what we always need to look at. But we would also have that fundamental requirement that whatever we do from now on must be resilient. We really need to plan in a way that we plan for the future, into which we have sadly already baked in a huge amount of climate change. So whatever we do should not be looking backwards 50 years, what hydrologists are always doing, on looking at river flows when they build a power plant or when they develop irrigation systems. They really need to be looking at the future, how that water will be available, what other uses will be required given climate change. And in this respect, I'm just very happy to see that all of the subjects, what we have discussed on policy approaches covering all sorts of building blocks of carbon pricing came up. But then in the middle, I really see adaptation and mitigation as, again, as a key message, a somehow hidden message of the last 3 days, what we keep in mind. And I'm hopeful that you would also remember that message. Can we move to the personal commitment? I would have difficulties on reflecting on this, because obviously it's a lot. Again, an angle which at the moment stands in the middle, participation. No matter how smart we believe we are on coming up with carbon market mechanisms and governance systems, we really need to build the momentum with inclusion, with really having all those who will be affected by these rules, who are actually once this change, but obviously who want to have a say in this. And I'm really happy to see participation staying in the middle, because what I see and bringing awareness and having that reach out and mobilization in a system where I understand that when you talk about building a local emission trading system, advising on voluntary effects, supporting local governments, agriculture, and all these other sectoral work, including transport, again being an extremely challenging part of emission reductions, and then at the same time staying very strong and committed in this field, are to me as well the key messages. We do need to act very quickly on a scale and speed which is unprecedented, but apparently we do have the knowledge, we do have the technologies, we do have systems to act. And I would like to conclude by saying that apparently those people who have survived these 3 days with me and who are still with us, over 100, do have the will to do that. And I'm hopeful that I have contributed to giving not only a bit more enthusiasm and commitment, but also providing with a handful of tools, knowledge, skills in the course of these last 3 days. So thank you very much for your active participation. I'm also hopeful that this will continue. I understand that the organizers are seeing this as not as a last step or not as a single step, but as a part of a bigger endeavor in supporting carbon pricing in your region. So let me thank you. Let me say a quick goodbye to you and hand back to the organizers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zot. I will just put up, before I say a concluding remarks, I would like to first and foremost thank Zot, and I say it on behalf of the participants as well. I think that it's been a pleasure listening to you, and you've been a great teacher to all of us in the course of this week. And of course, it's been a crash course. But listening to your the videos and the recording and the material that you have shared with us, I think it's going to remain with us for quite some time. And with your enthusiasm that as a teacher, I think as the students and the participants that we have been for the past 3 days, we look to working on these concepts and maybe possibly come back to you with any kind of suggestions or clarifications that we have. So if I can take also the liberty, I think a lot of the participants would like to connect directly with you as well. So if you would like, we could possibly share, you could possibly share your details with them. Otherwise, you're more than welcome to the participants, more than welcome to contact the Asia Let's Partnership, and we can directly direct you to Zot as well. Then I would also like to thank the GIZ as well as the International Climate Initiative, who have very graciously supported us in this project and also supported in giving us the material for this project. And we really look forward for their further inputs as we move forward in trying to bring the carbon markets training to more people in this region. So thank you, GIZ and ICI. And last but not the least, I would like to thank the participants without whom this training would not have been as successful as it has been. We have, over the course of 3 days, had more than 100 participants for a steady period of time for the 3 hours each day that we've had the training. And we've had participants from all over the world, more than 15 countries, and it's not been limited to only Asia, but across Africa as well as Europe, we've had participants. So thank you so much. And you've been active even in the chats. And it's been a pleasure to read the questions, the insightful questions that everyone has had, the chats which have allowed for better communication between each of the participants. Yes, unfortunately, we weren't able to do this in person or have more short group sessions. But I think through the chats and through the interaction that you had over AHA slides, you have been able to more than compensate for that. So thank you very much to all the participants. Moving on to the next steps, I would just like to just share my screen. Yes, second. Yes, so once again, I would request you to all fill up the evaluation form. This is basically going to be the form, the evaluation on the overall training and how it has been conducted. We look forward to any kind of feedback that will help us to better the training, and any additional support that you need or any additional topics that you think you as being representative of your own country and helping to achieve the NDC goals in your country, any kind of capacity building or technical assistance that you may require, please reach out to us, and we will be more than happy to help you in doing that. I would also request you to please join the NDC Finance Community of Practice of the Asia Let's Partnership if you have not already. This will help you to keep an update on all the activities that the Asia Let's Partnership does on climate finance. and for you to be to participate in more of these kind of trainings and webinars that we have in the coming weeks and months. Again, let me please don't worry, we do have the presentations and the recordings which will be shared to you via email to all the participants. And we look forward to also requesting you to promote this session and also ask your colleagues and peers to contact us. All participants will also be given certificates by after this training as well. We will do this in the subsequent week. So we look forward to that as well. And any other technical assistance that you think that the country requires in terms of meeting its ambitious NDC targets, please don't hesitate to contact the Asia-Let's partnership, and we'll be more than happy to help you. So thank you very much once again. It's been a great pleasure listening to all of you, as well as thank you very much to Zot, who has been an integral part of this training. And we look forward to having you all in subsequent sessions that we conduct. So thank you very much. And we look forward to your inputs in the evaluation form and any kind of support that we can carry on from here. And thank you so much, and all the best for all the wonderful work that all of you have been doing in the countries, and we look forward to making a better future. So thank you all. Thank you, Zot. Yes, bye-bye.
I just put up my contact details for all of you now filling in the evaluations. That well, feel free to reach out. Obviously, feel free to connect it on LinkedIn. Where recently I have been a bit quiet due to personal reasons, but I expect to come back. And I should also share that I'm now working with the European Commission on a large global project on climate action, which includes India, Indonesia, Vietnam, China, from the region of what you belong to. So I expect that we will be having and crossing our paths very, very quickly, given that exposure to Asia for me for the coming years. Wishing you all the best, and I hope that this will continue and you will have well a healthy and happy life in climate action, which I'm hopefully marginally supported in the course of the last 3 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Yes, the survey form will be will pop up on your screens once you leave the Zoom platform. Thank you.